Okay, let's continue our discussion on credit and debt. Let's first take a look at debt-related goals. So there are a number of debt-related goals that a client might have. We might be looking at paying off a mortgage before retirement. For younger clients, getting out of student loan debt, reducing credit cards, potentially using home equity to make home improvements. We might have debts on cars, or planned purchases for future cars. So there's all kinds of stuff that we can see that it may be helpful to use debt to help support the goal, or we may be trying to eliminate debt to free up cash flows to fund other goals. And so all of those would qualify as debt-related goals. So there are some good reasons to hold debt. Oftentimes you'll hear people classify debt as either good debt or bad debt. Now, I don't really like the terminology of good or bad in relation to financial products, right? Financial products, money itself is neutral. It's not good or bad, but how we use it might be good or bad, right? And so when we're talking about debts, we're talking about a tool, and we're wanting to use this tool as effectively as possible to help us make progress towards what we're trying to accomplish. Okay, so when we're talking on good debt, one of the questions that we have to ask ourselves is, will taking on the debt help the client meet a goal, whether it be short term or long term? All right, and if the answer is yes, then debt may be a good solution, right? We can't just put it in this pigeonhole and say, hey, listen, debts are bad. Don't take out debts. Always be debt free, whatever the case may be. Now, some clients may have a preference for being debt free. That's a completely different story, but we can use debt as an effective tool for making progress. So we're looking at different types of debt. Here's a list of options that you might be working with in a client situation, right? Credit card debt, lines of credit. Unsecured lines of credit are very similar to credit cards. We'll talk a little bit more about those as we continue our conversation. Then we have debt on assets. Some assets are depreciating, some assets are appreciating. And so, how do we treat debts when we're looking at different types of assets? And then debts on income earning assets. Okay, so there's a lot of different reasons that we may look at either eliminating or using debts to help a client reach their goals. So we're going to look over the course of the remainder of our discussions on debt at two different issues, right? Acquiring debt, taking on new debt to fund some objective, and then paying off debt, eliminating debt to free up cash flows to increase flexibility as we pursue other objectives. So when determining if we should acquire or pay off debt, analysis is going to be extremely helpful to us. And we can use a couple of different tools in determining whether or not debt could be a positive and productive thing on someone's balance sheet, or if it is being harmful and reducing flexibility. So we looked at debt ratios in Unit 3, and we're going to continue to work with these ratios to evaluate the appropriateness of debt levels going forward. We also talked about in Unit 3 different approaches to financial planning, right? Does it make sense based on the current life stage for debt to be higher or lower for a given client? And then we can factor in other things that come into play, right? Is the debt helping us grow net worth in the long term, right? And a lot of times the way that we look at that is, does the payment period, is it shorter than the economic life of the asset? A good example of this is a primary residence, right? If the primary residence is going to be the long-time home of the client, it's an appreciating asset. Can we set up our debts on that home, the mortgage, to where the payment period is shorter than the economic life? Same thing for cars, right? If we're going to drive a car for 5 years and we're using debt to fund the purchase of that car, then we may want to set up the payment period to be shorter than the economic life. This prevents what we call being upside down, right? For the debt being greater than the equity in the asset. We want it to be the other way around, right? We want to grow the equity in the asset so that we can use that asset in a positive way if need be. We often also consider any tax considerations that may come into play. Some debts have tax benefits. Again, mortgages are good examples of this. Home equity products have tax deductibility tied to them. And so Tax advantages may end up subsidizing the interest cost of debts and may be an important consideration when we're looking at different alternatives. So our job is to use the tools that are available in our uh, uh, at our disposal, right? Debt is a tool that's available. And so we're going to use the tools that are available, and we're going to balance current and future needs based on the client's goals to come up with the best solutions that we possibly can. All right, so when we're acquiring debt, let's consider different sources of debt. Again, we're all very familiar with credit cards. Personal loans are pretty commonly used. Personal loans can be either secured or unsecured. When we talk about a secured debt is one that has an asset backing the debt. A good example of this is a car. A car loan is secured by the car itself so that if the individual that has the car loan can't make their payments, then the lender has an asset that they can retrieve to offset their risk of lending money, right? So can't make your car payments, lender will take the car back, and they could sell that car to pay off the debt on that car, and it serves as a protection to the lender. Okay, unsecured debts, no assets backing that debt, and are a little bit more risky and therefore carry a little bit higher interest rates. Home equity loans and lines of credit. We're going to spend a decent amount of time talking about loans and lines of credit in our housing lecture as part of Unit 4. Retirement plans are also a common source of debt. Most qualified plans have the ability to allow plan participants to borrow from the plan. It just depends on whether or not the actual company offering the qualified plan agrees to allow plan loans. So for retirement plans that do have the ability to make loan disbursements to the participants in the plan, we see that that's not a completely and totally uncommon place for people to borrow from. Now, is it optimal? It depends on the situation. But we don't think about that as a common source of debt, but it is relatively common in practicality. And then family and friends. Also maybe seems like a last resort, but we see that debts to families aren't all that uncommon. Okay, so that's an introduction to debt. In our next lecture, we're going to talk a little bit more about paying off debt specifically, and we'll continue to look at this idea of how we can use this as an effective tool to help make progress towards goals.